$3 and a handwritten letter. That was all Jonas Pratt had to prove he was about to become a married man. And even the letter he could not fully read, since half of it was written in characters he had never learned. He stood at the platform in Miller's Bend, Wyoming Territory, in the white heat of a July afternoon in 1883, holding his hat in both hands the way a man holds something to keep it from shaking loose. The matchmaker's letter from San Francisco had promised a woman of good character, sound health, and a willingness to travel to a farm that most sensible people would have called a losing proposition. It said nothing about what she looked like, and it said nothing about what she would think of him, and Jonas had spent the whole ride into town telling himself that none of that mattered, because a wife was a wife, and a farm needed one whether or not either party found much to admire in the other. He was 28 years old, and he had buried both his parents and one brother in the same stretch of dry ground he was trying to farm, and there were men in Miller's Bend who called him unlucky to his face, and worse behind his back. He owned 160 acres under the Homestead Act, a dugout house with a side roof that leaked when it rained, $4 in a coffee tin, and a debt to the matchmaker's agent that he had paid off $1 silver at a time over 11 months of selling eggs and mending fences for the Larson place down the road. The train came in on time, which in that country was itself a kind of miracle, and Jonas watched the passenger car doors the way a man watches a door he is not sure he wants opened. She stepped down onto the platform in a gray Cheong Sam, the fabric dust-streaked from 3,000 miles of travel, her black hair pinned with a simplicity that told him nothing about who she actually was. She was 22, small enough that the porter set her single trunk down beside her like it might outweigh her, and she looked at Miller's Bend, Wyoming Territory, the way a person looks at a place they have decided in advance to survive rather than love. Her name was Leanne Zhao, and she had crossed an ocean and half a continent to marry a stranger, and the first thing she said to him, in English carrying the careful precision of someone who had studied the language rather than simply grown up inside it, was not a greeting at all. "You are Jonas Pratt," she said. It was not a question. "You are 3 inches shorter than the description in your letter suggested, and you have not shaved in 2 days. I would like to know why before we go any further." Jonas stood there with his hat in his hands and felt something in his chest do a thing he did not have a name for. He had expected a woman who would be grateful or frightened or at the very least quiet. He had not expected to be corrected on the platform within 10 seconds of meeting her. "The letter exaggerated," he said finally, "and I've been up since 4 mending a fence line that a fool banker's cattle keep breaking through. I didn't have time for a razor." Something in her face shifted, not quite a smile, but an acknowledgment that his answer had passed some private test she had not announced. "That is an honest answer," she said. "I was told to expect a man who lied easily. I did not expect one who admitted his own foolishness so quickly." "Who told you to expect that?" "Everyone," Leanne said, and picked up her own trunk before he could reach for it, hefting it with more strength than her frame suggested she carried, and began walking toward the wagon before he had finished processing that she had answered a question with a word that opened 10 more. The ride out to the farm took the better part of 2 hours, the wagon wheels grinding through ruts baked hard by a summer that had not seen real rain in 6 weeks, and Leanne sat beside him in a silence that was not unfriendly so much as observant. She watched the land the way Jonas imagined a merchant watched a ledger, cataloging rather than admiring, and twice she asked him questions that surprised him with their precision. How many acres were under cultivation? What the soil tested like after a dry season? Whether he had considered rotating a legume crop to restore what the wheat had taken out of the ground. "Where did you learn about crop rotation?" Jonas asked, because farmers' wives back east did not generally arrive already knowing more about soil depletion than half the men who farmed it. My father was a merchant in Canton, Leon said. He kept accounts for 3 trading houses and taught me numbers before he taught me to read Chinese characters properly, because he said a woman who understood a ledger would never be cheated by a man who assumed she could not. She looked at him directly for the first time since the platform. I understand this arrangement was made through a debt your brother owed to my father's associate in San Francisco. I would like to know the truth of that debt, Mr. Pratt, and I would like to know it before we reach your home. Jonas's hands tightened on the reins. The debt was the one part of this whole arrangement he had hoped to explain slowly, over weeks, once trust had a chance to grow roots. His brother Samuel had borrowed against a shipment that never arrived, had died owing money to men who did not forgive debts simply because the borrower was in the ground, and the marriage arrangement had been the only way Jonas found to settle what Samuel owed without losing the farm outright. My brother borrowed money he couldn't pay back, Jonas said. Your father's associate offered to forgive the debt in exchange for an arranged marriage instead of cash, since cash was something I didn't have, and a hard-working wife was something his family in San Francisco thought might be worth more than money to a man trying to keep a farm running alone. He kept his eyes on the road. I know that's not romantic. I know most women would call that shameful. I wanted you to hear it from me plain, not hear it twisted into something worse once we got to talking with the neighbors. Leon was quiet for a long moment, the wagon wheels filling the silence with their steady grinding rhythm. My father did not choose this arrangement out of cruelty, she said finally. He chose it because he believed a woman with sense and a man with land and no one to help him were both being wasted apart from each other. He was not sentimental. He was practical. I have inherited that from him, whether or not it pleases you to hear it. It doesn't displease me, Jonas said. I've had enough of women who expect flowers. I need someone who can read a bad season coming before it arrives. Something in Leon's expression eased, just slightly, and for the rest of the ride she asked no more questions, though Jonas noticed her watching the fence lines and the wheat fields with the same careful attention she had given the platform in Miller's Bend, as though she were already deciding what needed fixing and in what order. The dugout house sat low against a rise of dry grass, its sod roof patched in 3 places with fresh cuttings that had not yet taken root, and when Leon stepped down from the wagon and looked at it, Jonas braced himself for disappointment he felt certain was coming. It is smaller than the letter described, she said. I never described it in the letter. I figured there wasn't a version of the truth that would sound good on paper. That was wise, Leon said, and walked toward the door without further comment, and Jonas found himself following her into his own home like a guest rather than the man who owned it, uncertain whether he had just been complimented or quietly judged and found acceptable anyway. The wedding itself took place 4 days later in front of the circuit preacher who rode through Miller's Bend twice a month, and it was a small enough affair that half the town did not learn of it until the following Sunday. Jonas wore his one good shirt. Leanne wore the same gray Cheong Sam she had traveled in, pressed and brushed clean, because she had brought nothing finer, and had told Jonas plainly that she saw no reason to pretend otherwise. A wedding dress is a lie people tell about a day, she said the morning of the ceremony, folding the Cheong Sam's collar with careful precision. I would rather my wedding be honest than beautiful. The preacher, a thin man named Obed Marsh, who had married half the county and buried the other half, read the vows in a voice made hoarse by decades of dust, and Jonas found himself watching Leanne's hands rather than her face during the ceremony, the way her fingers stayed perfectly still even as everything else about the moment felt unsteady to him. Her hands did not shake. His did, slightly, and he was grateful the preacher did not seem to notice. They were married before noon, and by that evening word had reached Miller's Bend that Jonas Pratt had brought home a Chinese wife, and the reaction in town split cleanly down a line Jonas had expected, but hoped foolishly might not fully materialize. The first real trouble arrived 11 days later in the shape of a man named Silas Crane, who owned the largest cattle operation within 30 miles and had been trying to buy Jonas's water rights for 2 years through offers that grew steadily less polite. Crane rode out to the farm on a Tuesday morning with 2 of his hands trailing behind him, and he sat his horse at the edge of Jonas's property with the particular stillness of a man who had never needed to raise his voice to get what he wanted. "Heard you got married," Crane said when Jonas came out to meet him, wiping his hands on a rag that did nothing to hide the fact that they had gone tense at his sides. "Heard she's Chinese." "Heard right," Jonas said. "Something you need, Silas? Or did you ride out here just to comment on my household?" "I need what I've needed for 2 years. That creek access running through your east pasture." Crane's eyes moved past Jonas toward the dugout house, where Leanne had come to stand in the doorway, arms folded, watching the exchange with an expression that gave away nothing. "Though I'll admit, this changes the conversation some. Folks in town aren't going to take kindly to a mixed household holding on to water the whole valley needs during a dry summer." "The water's mine by the deed I filed in 1879, Jonas said. "Same as it's been for 2 years every time you've asked." "Deeds can get contested," Crane said, mild as milk. And that mildness was exactly what made the sentence land as a threat rather than an observation. "Especially deeds belonging to men who suddenly look a good deal more foreign to the county than they did a month back." He turned his horse and rode off before Jonas could answer. And Jonas stood in his own yard with his hands curling into fists he had nowhere to swing, and it was Leanne's voice from the doorway that finally broke the stillness. "He is going to try to take your land," she said. It was not a question. "He's going to try," Jonas agreed. "He's been trying for 2 years, married or not. This just gives him a new argument to use in town." "Then we should know exactly what argument he intends to make, and we should know it before he makes it," Leanne said. And something in the flat practicality of her tone told Jonas that whatever fear she might have felt at Crane's implied threat had already been folded away somewhere useful, replaced by the same ledger-keeping instinct her father had taught her. "My father always said the man who loses is the one who reacts instead of preparing. We will not be the ones who react." The heat did not break for the rest of that week, and neither did the tension that had settled over the farm like dust that would not wash out a fabric. Jonas found himself watching Leanne in the days that followed with a growing and uncomfortable admiration, the kind that had nothing to do with what a matchmaker's letter had promised, and everything to do with what she actually did with her hands and her mind once she had decided a problem needed solving. She took over the household accounts within the first week, and within the second she had found and corrected an error in the feed merchant's ledger that had been overcharging Jonas by nearly $1 a month for the better part of a year. An error the merchant apologized for with visible embarrassment once Leanne laid out the arithmetic plainly on his own counter. "You've got a head for numbers most men in this territory don't have," Jonas said, the evening she showed him the corrected figures, sitting across the small table in the dugout house by lamplight. "Numbers do not lie the way people do," Leanne said. "That is why I trust them more." "Do you trust me?" Jonas asked, before he had fully decided to ask it. And the question sat in the lamp-lit room between them with a weight neither of them had expected from 3 plain words. Leanne set down the ledger she had been holding. "I trust that you told me the truth about the debt on the platform in Miller's Bend, when a lesser man would have waited until I could not easily leave," she said carefully. "I do not yet know if that is the same as trusting you completely. I have known you 11 days. "That's fair," Jonas said. "I don't reckon I've earned more than that yet." "No," Leanne agreed, "but you have not lost ground either, which is more than I expected from a stranger 3,000 miles from anyone who might hold you accountable if you had chosen otherwise." The compliment, if it was one, sat between them for a long moment, and Jonas found himself noticing, not for the first time, but for the first time he allowed himself to fully register it, the particular stillness of her hands when she was thinking hard about something, folded together on the table's rough wood, exactly the way they had been folded during the wedding ceremony. The trouble with Silas Crane escalated on a Thursday, 3 weeks into the marriage, when Jonas rode into Miller's Bend for supplies and found the general store owner, a heavy-set man named Walter Doss, suddenly reluctant to extend him the credit that had never once been questioned before. "Nothing personal, Jonas," Doss said, not meeting his eyes, rearranging tins on a shelf that did not need rearranging. "Just heard some talk is all, about your situation out at the farm. Folks are asking questions about whether a man married to someone from so far off ought to still hold the same standing in town he used to." "My money spends the same as anyone's," Jonas said. "Has it stopped being green overnight?" "Didn't say that." Doss finally looked at him, and there was something apologetic and something calculating both moving behind his eyes. "Just saying, Silas Crane's been talking to a lot of folks lately about deeds and water rights and who really belongs in this valley. Man like that, with his money, folks tend to listen, even when they don't want to." Jonas rode home that evening with his supplies half filled and his temper fully lit, and he found Leanne in the yard, tending the small garden she had started behind the dugout house, with seeds she had brought carefully wrapped from San Francisco, and he told her plainly what had happened in town. "Crane is turning the whole valley against us before he's even filed a paper," Jonas said. "Doss wouldn't extend credit. Said folks are asking whether we belong here." Leanne set down her trowel and stood, brushing dirt from her hands with the same deliberate care she brought to everything. "Then Crane intends to make this about belonging before he makes it about the deed," she said. "That is a mistake on his part, because belonging is a harder thing to prove with paper, but it is also a harder thing to disprove." "What do we do?" "We find out exactly what he is planning, and we make certain the valley sees the truth of it before he can finish telling his version first," Leanne said. "My father taught me that in Canton, when a rival merchant tried to spread word that our trading house cheated its customers, the lie moves fast. The truth must move faster, and it must be undeniable when it arrives." The following days settled into a strange, watchful rhythm, the kind of quiet that precedes something breaking rather than something mending. Jonas noticed Crane's men riding the boundary of his property more often than any legitimate business required, and twice he found fence posts along the east pasture that had been deliberately loosened, the kind of small sabotage that left no clear proof of a guilty hand, but plenty of inconvenience for the man who had to repair it. It was Leanne who discovered the deeper danger, 3 weeks into the trouble, going through the county land office's public records during a trip into Miller's Bend under the pretense of asking after a shipment of dry goods. She found, filed quietly and recently, a survey request from Silas Crane's attorney disputing the boundary lines of Jonas's original 1862 Homestead Act claim, arguing on a technicality involving an old, imprecise section of the original government survey that the east pasture and its creek access had never properly belonged to Jonas's father in the first place. "It is a forged interpretation of an old boundary line," Leanne said, laying out what she had copied from the public record onto their kitchen table that night, her handwriting neat and rapid in a mixture of English notation and shorthand only she could read. "Not an outright forged deed, something more clever. He is arguing the original survey was wrong, and that the true line puts the creek and 40 acres on his side rather than yours." "That's a lie," Jonas said. My father filed that claim in 1862. I've got the paper." Paper is only as strong as the survey behind it, and old government surveys in this territory were often done carelessly, by men paid by the mile rather than by accuracy, Leon said. Crane knows this. He has found a genuine flaw in an old document and intends to use it as a legitimate lever, not a lie a court could easily dismiss. So what do? We find the original surveyor, if he is still alive, and we get his testimony before Crane's attorney can file the dispute formally, Leon said, and we do it faster than a man who has already been planning this for weeks. The original surveyor, a retired man named Otis Bell, lived 4 days' ride away in a settlement along the rail line, and Jonas made the decision within the hour to go after him himself, leaving Leanne at the farm with a shotgun she had already proven in a demonstration behind the dugout house 2 days earlier that she knew how to load and fire with more competence than most men in the territory. "You should not go alone," Leon said the morning he left, standing in the yard with the early light catching the worry she was otherwise working hard to keep off her face. "Crane's men have been watching the roads." "Someone has to stay and hold the farm," Jonas said, "and I trust you to do it better than most men I know." Something in Leanne's expression shifted at that. A flicker of surprise quickly folded away, and she reached up without announcing the gesture and straightened the collar of his shirt with a brisk efficiency that did not fully disguise how her hand lingered there half a second longer than the task required. "Then do not be a fool on the road," she said. "I did not cross an ocean to become a widow in a Wyoming territory dispute over 40 acres of creek water." Jonas found Otis Bell 3 days later, an old man with clouded eyes and a memory sharper than his sight, who confirmed within an hour of careful conversation that the original 1862 survey had indeed been rushed, paid by the mile as Leanne suspected, but that his own field notes, kept in a battered tin box he had carried from posting to posting for 20 years, recorded the true boundary line clearly, and that line put the creek and the disputed 40 acres firmly on Jonas's side. "Crane's attorney came around here 2 weeks back, asking similar questions," Bell said, digging through the tin box with hands made unsteady by age. "I didn't tell him about these notes. Something about the way he asked made me want to keep them to myself a while longer." "Why?" Jonas asked. "Man asks a question already knowing the answer he wants. He's not looking for truth," Bell said. "He's looking for a lie he can wear like truth. I've surveyed enough land in this territory to recognize a man trying to steal it with paperwork instead of a gun." He handed Jonas the relevant page, brittle and yellowed but legible. "Get this in front of a judge before Crane's attorney files anything, and you'll keep your water." Jonas rode home with the survey notes wrapped carefully in oilcloth against his chest, and he arrived back at the farm on the 4th evening to find the yard eerily quiet, the dugout house's door standing open, and no sign of Leanne anywhere in the fading summer light. His heart went cold in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature. He called her name into the empty yard, and the only answer was the wind moving through the dry grass, and it was the sight of fresh boot prints, larger than his own, cutting across the vegetable garden Leanne had tended so carefully, that told him exactly how wrong this evening had already gone before he found the note nailed to the door. The note, unsigned but written in a hand Jonas recognized from a bill of sale Crane had once shown him at the feed store, offered a trade. The 40 acres and the creek access, signed over quietly and without a court dispute, in exchange for his wife returned unharmed by morning. Jonas stood in his own yard with the survey notes still pressed against his chest, and understood, with a clarity that steadied his shaking hands rather than worsening them, that Silas Crane had made the single costliest mistake of his career, because a man who would threaten what could not be replaced to steal something that could always be surveyed again had misjudged exactly how far Jonas Pratt was willing to go to get it back. He rode for Crane's ranch through the dark, the summer night thick with the smell of dry grass and distant thunder that promised rain the territory badly needed and had not received in 6 weeks. And he found the main ranch house lit up bright against the darkness. More men gathered around it than any legitimate business at this hour required. He did not ride in through the front gate. He left his horse a half-mile out and came in on foot, low and quiet along the fence line the way his father had once taught him to move when tracking a wounded deer. And it was pure chance, or perhaps something closer to instinct sharpened by fear, that led him to the old grain barn at the property's edge rather than the main house, where a single lantern burned low behind a half-open door. Inside, Leanne sat bound to a support post with rope around her wrists, her gray Cheong Sam torn at one shoulder. A single guard posted near the door with a rifle across his knees, dozing in the heat of the lantern's warmth. She was not weeping. She was watching the guard's breathing with the same careful, patient attention she gave a ledger, waiting for the exact moment his guard would slip. Jonas moved along the barn's outer wall, found a gap in the boards wide enough to see through, and understood in one look that Leanne had already begun working the rope at her wrists loose against a splintered edge of the post, slow and deliberate, buying herself time rather than waiting passively for rescue. He made his choice in the space of a single held breath. He circled to the barn's rear door, found it unlatched, and came through it low and fast the moment the guard's dozing head dipped forward, driving his full weight into the man before the rifle could be raised, and the two of them went down hard into the straw in a scramble of fists and elbows that ended only when Jonas's knuckles connected solidly with the guard's jaw and the man went still. "Leanne!" He was at her side in 3 steps, working the loosened rope free from her wrists with hands that shook now that the danger had a shape he could finally see and fight rather than fear in the abstract. "I had it nearly worked loose myself," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor Jonas could feel in her hands as he freed them. "You did not need to come alone into a ranch full of armed men." "Wasn't going to leave you here to finish the job yourself," Jonas said. "Can you run?" "I can do considerably more than run," Leanne said, and reached down without hesitation to take the unconscious guard's rifle from where it had fallen into the straw, checking its load with the same quick competence she had shown behind the dugout house 2 days earlier. They moved together toward the rear door, and it was the sound of raised voices from the main house, someone having noticed the guard's absence, that told them their window for a quiet escape had already closed. 3 men came around the corner of the barn with lanterns raised, Silas Crane himself among them, his earlier mildness entirely gone, replaced by the flat fury of a man watching his leverage walk away on its own 2 feet. "That's far enough," Crane said, and one of his men raised a rifle in the lantern light. Leanne did not hesitate. She raised the rifle she had taken from the fallen guard and fired a single shot into the ground at Crane's feet, close enough to make him and his men flinch backward, the crack of it splitting the summer night wide open. "The next one will not aim for the ground," she said, her voice carrying a flat certainty that made even Crane go still. "I have watched my husband ride 4 days to prove a survey line true. I have sat bound to a post for 6 hours without weeping, and I have decided in that time that I am considerably less afraid of you than you have assumed." Crane's men hesitated, glancing toward their employer for direction he seemed momentarily unable to provide, and Jonas used the opening to step forward, the oilcloth-wrapped survey note still pressed against his chest. "I've got Otis Bell's original field notes," Jonas said. "Proof the creek and the 40 acres were always mine. Your whole case just went up like dry grass in a fire, Silas, and now you've added kidnapping to whatever's left of your reputation in this valley." "You've got nothing," Crane said, though his voice had lost its earlier certainty. "A survey clerk's old notes against my attorney's filing? That's nothing in front of a territorial judge." "It's considerably more than nothing when the surveyor himself is willing to testify in person," Jonas said. And it's considerably more than nothing set against a story about you holding a woman at gunpoint in your own barn to force a land deal. Word travels fast in this territory, Silas. Faster than a lie can outrun it once enough honest men have seen the truth for themselves. The standoff held for a long, taut moment, the lantern light throwing long shadows across the dry grass, and it was the distant sound of more riders approaching, drawn by the earlier gunshot, that finally broke Crane's resolve. He lowered his hand, and his men lowered their rifles, and Jonas took Leanne's arm and walked her past all of them toward the fence line, without either of them looking back. They rode double on Jonas's horse back toward their own farm through the last hour before dawn, the summer sky beginning to lighten at its eastern edge, and somewhere along that quiet ride, with Leanne's arms wrapped around his waist and her cheek resting against his back in a stillness that had nothing to do with fear any more, Jonas understood that whatever this marriage had begun as, a debt settled and a stranger accepted out of necessity, it had become something else entirely somewhere in the space of 3 weeks and one very long night. Silas Crane's land dispute collapsed within the month. Otis Bell's testimony delivered in person to a circuit judge who took a notably dim view of a wealthy rancher attempting to alter a legitimate homestead boundary through intimidation. And word of the barn confrontation spread through Miller's Bend exactly as Jonas had predicted, souring what little goodwill Crane had left among his neighbors and turning the town's earlier suspicion of Leanne into something closer to grudging than genuine respect. 3 months passed, the dry summer finally breaking into a season of steady rain that filled the creek Crane had tried so hard to steal, and the wheat that Leanne had insisted on rotating with a legume crop came in fuller than any harvest Jonas's land had produced in 5 years. Walter Doss extended credit again without hesitation, and more than that, began asking Leanne's opinion on his own store's accounts, having heard through the valley grapevine about the ledger error she had caught within her first week in the territory. On a warm evening in early autumn, Jonas found Leanne in the garden behind the dugout house, tending the same seeds she had carried from San Francisco, now grown thick and green against a Wyoming sky turning gold at its edges, and he stood watching her for a long moment before she noticed him. "You are staring," she said, without turning around. "I'm allowed to stare at my own wife." "That word still sounds strange, spoken the way you say it now," Leanne said, straightening and brushing dirt from her hands. "Softer than it sounded on the platform in Miller's Bend." "I didn't know you yet on that platform," Jonas said. "I know you now. Every part of it. The numbers, the ledgers, the way you didn't cry once in 6 hours tied to a post because you were too busy working the rope loose yourself." Leanne studied him in the fading gold light, and something in her careful, guarded composure eased, the way it had been easing slowly for months now, one honest conversation at a time. "My father sent me here to settle a debt," she said. "I did not expect to find a man worth staying for once the debt was paid in full." "Debt's long settled," Jonas said. "Whatever's left between us now, that's just us choosing it plain." "Then I choose it," Leanne said, simply, and reached for his hand the way she had reached for his shirt collar the morning he rode out after Otis Bell, brisk and certain, no longer hiding how long she let the touch linger. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.